Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, actually happy to be joined by a familiar face and a new face. We've talked so often on so many of the episodes here of late about one of the things that Alexis and I have enjoyed most about our podcast experience is getting to meet new people and getting to interact with those people and then becoming part of our podcasting community. So I'm going to introduce a familiar face and a familiar voice. Familiar face to me, just familiar voice to you. I can see his face. You can't. But a familiar voice, that's Chris Capola. Chris, say hi to the good folks.
Hi to the good folks.
Yeah, that's almost become our running joke with you. And I also have with me, happy to have join us here, Eric Bond. Eric fits in that category of listener who reached out and said, hey, I'd like to be part of this. And as we've talked about so often, that's what we're a part of. So, Eric, I'll let the next sound that our listeners hear be your voice, let you introduce yourself, and then we'll get rolling with today's topic and some discussion.
Well, thanks, Don. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric. So excited to be joining us today. And yes, my last name is Bond. Please take this moment to get all the jokes out in your head. I'm sure I haven't heard any of them before.
I doubt there's ever been a reference to a particular agent on Her Majesty's Secret Service. I doubt that that's ever happened, not once in your life.
You are very lucky Alexis is not with us.
Yeah,
especially with that flag in your background. That would just derail everything right now.
I'm sure there is not a collection of unpaid child support stacks from various continents.
We're happy to have our Bond, Eric Bond. So you said get it out of my system. I think I've managed to get it out of my system now. If at some point I make the mistake of referring to you as Mr. Rush or Eric Rush, that's because Eric's also one of our contributors. And so we will have a couple of Erics. You can't go wrong if you've got a couple of Erics. So again, Eric, welcome. Glad to have you joining us. And I'm actually intrigued by most of the topics that we cover, or else we wouldn't do them. That's sort of the whole point of the exercise. But particularly intrigued because we were just talking off podcast about the various, we come up with 3-4 different ways to depart on this one. This is one of those ones that it's rich in even the forms of departure here. So what we're going to be talking about today, and today's topic here on A Fork in Time, is going to be around, of all things, and we will explain once we get back, but the following all fit the description: American presidents, manifest destiny, cannibalism, and war. If you're intrigued, we welcome you back after the break. Hope you join us then.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, joined by Chris Capola, and also joined by a new friend and a new participant here on the podcast. That is Eric Bond. It's at this point that we allow you to press pause on your listening and make your own Bond jokes. But we're not going to continue to go down that path as we move forward. So as I mentioned before the break, our topic today has elements of, I think what I said, American presidents, manifest destiny, the potential for cannibalism, and war. So having said that, now I'm going to turn it over to Eric to explain the historical of what our topic is all about today.
Go ahead, and if I can jump in real quick, we are Chris. Sports fans. Team name origins. Let's throw
Team
that
name
in
origins.
there too.
There you go. You can get that in there too. Yeah. Cool. Thanks. Go ahead, Eric.
All right, everybody. I hope you will permit me a bit of an artistic flair here. I am a playwright. Am I a good playwright? Well, that depends on what you think. So here is the what did. Let me take you back once upon a time, once upon an antebellum, if you will. And there was a Midwestern lawyer, smart, brilliant even, charming, maybe not the best husband. I am, of course, speaking of Lansford Hastings. That's right, the Lansford Hastings, failed pioneer and aspiring Napoleon. He is the author of a little book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, published in 1845, and he had a mission in life. That mission, take over the state of California, currently under the rule of the Mexican government. What was his plan? Simple. Get enough Anglo settlers, preferably from the United States, into California to effect what has been called a bloodless revolution. He was inspired in part by what had happened in Texas.
Yeehaw!
How am I not surprised? Casual Texas reference. And he was also inspired by the known Swiss-German John Sutter and his Sutter's Fort, also known as New Helvetia. Lovely outpost, especially if you're into slave labor, which it was built on, of the following Native American groups. Anywho, deciding that he wanted to build his own little kingdom, which he was going to call Montezuma, Lansford Hastings decided to write the book. And he decided to cherry pick the heck out of it, make it sound too good to be true, because it was too good to be true. But it was enough for George Donner and James Reed, a farmer and a businessman, both often failed, but still with enough money. And they were inspired to take a small group of settlers out onto the Oregon Trail, break off halfway through to take Hastings Cutoff, which would lead them through the Utah Salt Lake Desert and the Watashi Mountains. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, please take this moment to correct me. I'll let you have it. Oh my goodness, you corrected me. Thank you very much for doing that. Let's proceed. So the settlers were beset with a multitude of problems. There were raids by Native American tribes. There were frequent arguments. There were two actual cases of murder, one which saw James Reed be banished from the party. However, he was able to make it to California on his own. However, this did result in some problems. As we might know from popular culture, the Donner Party would find themselves trapped in the Sierra Mountains and be forced to commit cannibalism, in some cases to survive. Now, thankfully, they didn't usually have to draw lots. They did in one case, but then they couldn't go through with it. But then that person died, so it was okay. And if you hear that rustling in the back, that's my cat deciding to make an exploration of my office. He is most welcome to vacate, please. Thank you, sir. So, a majority of the Donner Party would actually survive. Of the 89, 47 would survive. 10 deaths were female participants. The remaining 32 were all male. So, definitely better to be one of the ladies at this time. And they would find themselves trickling through to California in successive patterns after rescue parties were sent. In the meantime, they found out, California has just become a U.S. territory. Because of top of everything happening, the U.S.-Mexican War breaks out over the Trenton Affair, in which over a border dispute, a group of soldiers were attacked, killed, and taken prisoner by the Mexican government. Now, you might be wondering at this time, well, yes, the Mexican-American War happened. Mexico loses. America takes hold of Nevada, California, Texas, Utah, and New Mexico, along with a nice payout from the US government under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But what about Abraham Lincoln? Where does he come into this? Here's where. James Reed had filed for bankruptcy, and in order to hide his money, he needed a very good lawyer. Who else but his old comrade at arms from the Black Hawk War, Abraham Lincoln? And to sweeten the pot, he even offered Abraham Lincoln a spot on his journey. Come on, Abe. It'll be safe. It'll be great. There's plenty of opportunities for an aspiring politician out there. Why, you could even become king, such as, and this is a true story, a man named James Strang became king of Beaver Island at this time. It did not work out well. Abe Lincoln took the idea to his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and she said, I'm paraphrasing, of course, well, we've just had a child who's 3, and I'm currently in the midst of a pregnancy with our second child. So no, I don't feel like going on to the dinner party. However, I will say goodbye to them. So at their departure, Mary Todd Lincoln could be seen waving her napkin around, wishing them a good journey. It would all be in vain.
Until you suggested the topic, Eric, I had never, that was one of the first things that intrigued me about the topic was understanding the Lincoln connection and the Reed connection. And I had never realized if we had the power of going back in time and could take a picture of it again, we would see Mary Todd, as you say, waving goodbye to the settlers as they're heading off. And also the thing that jumped out at me, just reminding myself of the history and the timing, was realizing the backdrop of this happening as the Mexican-American War is breaking out and coming into being. I was telling Chris off podcast, I always think of 48 as the year for the war because it's when it ends. I don't think about 46 when it begins, of course, right after the annexation of Texas in 45. So this connected a lot of things for me and caused me to jump back in. Anything else we ought to know about the what did, Eric?
For the what did, now a majority of the settlers, as I said, did survive. Most of the group was actually able to get by without resorting to cannibalism. However, it did happen, but they kind of pinned it on one German settler whose name was Louis Kessberg. Kessberg may or may not, it's sketchy, bragged about being a cannibal. He was later called in newspapers the human cannibal. It's redundant, but, it sells. I suppose they could be worried about hamsters, but that's a childhood memory I don't want to go into right now. Along with this time, it's worth noting Lansford Hastings, who's kind of spearheading this, he actually said, I will lead any party who will meet me at Fort Bridger in Wyoming. If you meet up with me there, we'll go ahead. So the party, when they broke off on July 17th of 1846, did go to Fort Bridger to try and find him. They arrived about the 27th, only to be told, well, Hastings left. However, he is leaving a series of letters on sticks for you to figure out and puzzle your way through. James Reed and one of the others did ride up to meet Hastings and tried to convince him to come back to their party, but Hastings said he would feel guilty and quickly sketched out what roads they were supposed to take on the ground using a stick. Needless to say, it did not work out for James Reed, who's been, at this point, improvising his way through the trail. So there has been some interesting debate about, well, is Lansford Hastings really to blame? Yeah, he wanted to be king of California. Who doesn't? But it's really James Reed's fault for refusing to listen to anybody else. Multiple mountaineers, such as James Kleiman, who advised them, don't go on this cutoff. This is a terrible plan.
Yeah,
But
and one of the interesting things to me, looking at the cutoff and looking at some of the maps, first of all, it's not actually shorter. It's sort of proposed as a shortcut, but it's like 50 or 60 miles longer than the traditional trail, which went further to the north. And as you're pointing out, there had not been experience with wagons going across. It had been done on foot by Hastings and a few others, but never had wagons gone across. And the other thing that jumped out at me about the historical what did is realizing that the timing on this 6 to 8 month journey over to Oregon, which is where the trail traditionally went to, or you go down to California at that point, was if you left too early, you ran the risk of getting stuck in situations with mud conditions because of rainfall. You had to cross during the summer when there were ample grasses and other natural flora that the horses and mules and others would be able to use for food and for fuel, so you didn't have to carry everything. And of course, if you left too late, you ran the risk of the early snowfalls in the Sierra Nevadas trapping you in. So it was like there was the perfect alignment of the things you had to put into place here to sort of leave at the right time, move at the right speed, get to the right place to not run into problems. And everything about the Donner, sometimes referred to as the Donner Reed Party, everything about this party is they were late. They sort of missed the boat. They got to Fort Bridger. They made the dumb choice of going left instead of right, where no one had really gone before. They get trapped in all of that, and things turn out. I guess the other thing that jumped out at me, just looking at the historical what did, we'll jump off to the what if here shortly, is you assume when you hear this, sort of in history, that the whole party died, when in fact the majority, a slim majority, but the majority did actually make it, traumatized by the experience. There was the questions of whether there had been cannibalism or not. I think most people would agree there were some instances of it, although it was not widespread. Not everyone participated in it. In fact, they weren't even all together during parts of this. They were strung out, as you said, in various rescue parties in the way that were there. So it was a good reminder for me to better understand just the real historical what did. And as I often do, I'll stick in the show notes a couple of links there to some of the historical the Wikipedia article. Nothing else is a good place to start, but some of the other things I found. Chris, did you have any comments about the what did before we get too much further?
I had one question that I know the answer to, but I think it's going to be a nice transition to what's coming up. You mentioned that when the party left, Mary Todd saw them off. Where was Abe? Was Abe there to see them off as well?
It's actually not recorded if Abe was there. He may have been at a political meeting, from what I understand of the record. However, I do have one additional fact. Somebody who was part of Hastings' group that he was traveling with at this time rode ahead. He was named Edwin Bryant, and he was a friend of the Donner Party, and he had rode further ahead by himself through the Hastings cutoff and saw there's no way wagons can get through here. So he doubled back, left a letter at Fort Bridger, and said, please give this to the Donners so they don't waste their lives. And then Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez, the owners of the fort, hid the letter. They may have actually destroyed it because they were worried that if people didn't take the Hastings cutoff, they would suffer financially. It's kind of the best thing I can equate to it right now is if you've seen the movie Jaws, and these guys are essentially the mayors of Martha's Vineyard, non-warning people there's a shark.
The rumors of the shark are overblown. Don't worry about that.
More of a if we're trying to keep it, chronologically similar, Blazing Saddles, where you want the railroad to actually run through your town, something like that, where yeah.
Well, it's referred to as a fort. It really was just sort of a trading outpost and store that happened to be along the prominent route that's there. The other thing I realized, I never played this as a child, despite it being so popular. I never played the computer game Oregon Trail, which is where most people would know some of the things that are along the lines of the event, what's happening here, and also the difficulty of moving. One thing to be on horseback, it's another thing to be on wagons. Very different experience, as was pointed out, in terms of crossing the Great Salt Lake and just all kinds of interesting things there about the Hastings cutoff, and the fact that the shortcut is not always the best route to go, I think is one of the more interesting things that are there. Anything else about the what did, guys, before we jump to our selected what if, because we had multiple ones to choose from. I want to talk about that just sort of briefly before we actually go down the path that we chose.
Well, Lansford Hastings actually became a member of the Confederate Army and tried to spearhead an idea that he would take over California for the Confederates to seize gold. this did not work out. And after the war, he essentially tried the same scam again, this time writing a new book called The Immigrant's Guide to Brazil, where he was going to lead a bunch of confederados, as they were called, in Brazil to a new settlement and try the whole thing over again with a bloodless revolution if he could get enough white settlers there to filibuster. He ended up dying on the boat ride over, so we never will know if we could have ever seen the rise of Emperor Hastings.
Emperor Hastings, or what he may have called his powerful new kingdom there in South America. Interesting. So when we first approached this, and when Eric first suggested the topic, there were a couple of things that jumped out at me, with the connection, obviously, between the Lincolns and the Reeds, and so thus the Donner Party. One possibility would be, and Eric sort of already covered this, what if the Lincolns had joined the historical expedition? It's not expedition. It's an exercise in immigration. If they had joined the party and they had gone with the group, would be one place that we could go. But we settled upon a slightly different point of departure, I think, for good reason, and that was the idea that Lincoln had enough influence with Reed. And by the way, Reed was able to, as I understand it from the things that I read historically, part of the reason Reed was able to go was what Lincoln did in terms of that bankruptcy case and salvaging and hiding some fortune. Reed would not have had the means to go if it weren't for Lincoln. That's part of the reason for inviting Lincoln and his wife to go along. But we decided to make the point of departure something a little bit different. I'm going to see if I can express it. Correct me if I have it wrong, Eric. But the idea was that Lincoln was already in communication with a sitting member of the United States Congress about the potential for running for the Congress there in Illinois at the time. And so he is choosing not to go because he's thinking about his political fortune. And you have an interesting twist on that, which is, what if we don't have Illinois being the land of Lincoln? But what if in our departure, we actually end up with California instead of being home of the 49ers, sports team reference there for you, Chris, as you mentioned earlier, but that somehow California becomes the land of Lincoln. So explain how that works, Eric, in our alternate timeline.
So how this would work in our alternate timeline, and I know we discussed two variations of that, where Lincoln is able to talk them into holding off on their trip maybe one more year, because at this time, Mary was still pregnant with who will be their second child, Edward Baker Lincoln, who tragically dies in 1850 from complications, I believe, of tuberculosis. The other alternative is that Lincoln decides to go on his own to travel with the historical Donner Party. Now, Lincoln, I think, has a fair chance of surviving, even if the events should somehow replicate themselves from that 1846 period to, let's say, they leave in 1848, which might honestly be better, because at that point they'll have the gold rush and a whole slew of settlers coming into California. Now, I think Lincoln himself, upon arriving in California, would try to establish himself as, I am a trained lawyer, I am experienced, I have served in my own state house of representatives, therefore I am one of the best qualified people to help form this new government. A lot of California's representatives at that time, and their governor, had come down from Oregon, where they had established their bona fides there. So in this case, he would be traveling with the Donners and establishing himself politically within California around the time of 1848 to 1850.
Okay. And that's it's interesting to me. That's an interesting critical time. Obviously, it's at the end of the Mexican-American War. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo settles a bunch of borders. There's some money that's paid for part of that. The rest of it's just held on to. But then you also have, shortly thereafter, the find at Sutter's Mill, you have the 49er experience. And one of the things that's always amazing to me when I read about California history before the gold rush, pretty sparsely populated place. All in all, we think about the explosion of what becomes San Francisco and the other population explosions. Those are as a result of the gold rush, of the finding of gold and what happens there. Prior to that, it's attractive, pretty territory. The ground shakes every once in a while if you can live with that. But it's not the California that we think of just a few years later. And obviously the California of 1850, which is admitted as part of the compromise, finds itself smack dab in the middle of the things that are now leading up to, of all things, the Civil War, which is obviously going to have an impact on the real timeline for Lincoln. So just thinking some of that, all of that being thought through together for me is sort of an interesting thing, just how compacted that little piece of history is in terms of actually what happens there. I actually like the idea of the slightly later going Lincoln and how that plays out, and getting him to California safely, along with others who had influence and power and a little bit of money to go with it. The other thing that strikes me, though, just think about the original timeline. If Lincoln had gone with the original group, maybe he would have been smart enough to make a different decision at the Hastings cutoff situation. He might have brought a little let's call it intellect that might have been well served, and some wisdom that might have been well served there if Lincoln goes along with the original party. But let's say, for the purpose of our alternate timeline, we're going to get Lincoln there with the delayed scenario a year later. So we have him, Mary Todd, in tow with now, I guess, an infant, a toddler, a newborn, so to speak, but they're there. So do we just assume that Lincoln's going to be, because of the force of personality that he is, that he's going to be successful in establishing himself in some political role? Is that a fair thing to assume? Chris, you have any thoughts on that?
I think he would. I think that's very likely. I think he's certainly comes close in Illinois to becoming a United States senator. I think in a smaller pond, he can probably, I don't know what form it takes. It could be governor. It could be senator. I'm not sure of that.
The reason I myself lean towards the governorship, Chris, is in the election of 1848, Lincoln had thrown he always wanted Henry Clay to be president. Even when he became president himself, he said, I'm a Republican, but really in my heart of hearts, I'm a Whig. But when Henry Clay did not garner enough support, Lincoln, that is, threw all of his energy into campaigning for Zachary Taylor, in the hopes that Taylor would reward him with a governorship of a territory, ideally out west. So that's why I lean more towards governorship. I think that's something of an expressed interest for him. Also, I think that Lincoln is able to communicate the Whig policies, especially towards having a strong banking system, having a strong currency. That is going to be very appealing, especially with the gold rush going on in California, is that they're going to think we need an internal structure, so that way it's not just the Wild West.
So one thought question I have. So he's behind Taylor in 48. Is he trying to become an appointed governor? Do we think he's an appointed governor of the territory of California? Or does he 2 years later either take over as the elected governor or run as the elected governor when it actually becomes a state? Because it's very soon afterwards that it has more of that formal state structure, as opposed to a territory that honestly a president can kind of hand out.
Right. Drawing off on our own timeline, the first governor of California is Peter, please forgive me if I pronounce his middle name incorrectly, Hardeman Burnett. He was appointed by the California Republic before they were recognized then as a state, and then he was and still is recorded as their first official governor. So I think in this case, it would have to be that he runs for governor, because Burnett does not last. He actually resigns. And in fact, it's not until their third governor that someone is actually elected and serves a full term. I don't know if they were also having issues with the recall then, but that's just me.
It's California politics. It starts early and continues on, right?
Hey, I'm a proud son of San Diego, and like a lot of proud Californians, I live in Arizona.
I shouldn't be saying this from where I am right now, but one of the things Don and I did discuss, the state I am originally from, every single president from there is also claimed by another state. They get out every chance they get.
Well, then Chris will often point out that there have been many quote unquote Texas presidents that don't deserve to be called that. We've had that conversation here of late as well. So to me, the most intriguing thing about Lincoln out west is I start thinking about, again, the contrast. That's to me what's so interesting about alternate history is, what gets negated. There's the new positive that you create, but the things that you definitely know that you lose. Lincoln in California, in whatever role that he's in, he's a governor. He's a member of the state legislature. He's maybe the senator from California. Whatever that role is, he's probably not debating Stephen Douglas anytime, in 54, unless, you can come up with a pretty interesting way that would have happened, because that happened in the context of a different electoral, situation that he was involved in.
Well, if anything, he's likely to be a partner with Stephen Douglas. The first about 4 California governors were Democrats, but Lincoln agreed with Stephen Douglas about the necessity of an intercontinental railroad, especially now in California with the gold rush. That's going to be imperative. Yeah. I think something that, for lack of a better term, worries me. I'm just a natural worrier. I'm a middle child, so maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. Is the fact that Lincoln, if we assume he is the governor or some other federal office holder, say a senator, he has to deal with the fact that he's from a now much more diverse populace. There are Mexicans who are holdovers from the government transition. There are tons of Native American tribes who have not had treaties with the U.S. government. There is a burgeoning population of Chinese immigrants coming in. And at this time, the first governor, Burnett, who we were talking about, he was trying to institute a policy of, I don't want California to be a slave state. I want California to exclude any Black persons from entering, which was the rule in Oregon. It's why the KKK had such a popular second rising up there back in the, I want to say, post-World War I period, 1920s. So Lincoln is now being forced into this position where he also has to address his own thoughts about race and class in just a way that he never was challenged back when he was representing Illinois.
I think that's a good point. And so one of the questions you get into, we talk about this often on the podcasts, are, it's almost nature versus nurture, how much you're influenced by the things you're influenced by. Lincoln, one of the things that always has astonished me about Lincoln, Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Team of Rivals is one of my favorite books. I just looked over my bookshelf to see it there. I haven't read it in a number of years. I'm due for a rereading or re-listening to it actually here sometime soon. One of the things that you always hear expressed about Lincoln was the level of his intelligence, and almost any biographer, any historian will tell you he was intellectually, his IQ was very high. You can argue that his EQ was also very high in some of the ways that he dealt with things, like what's expressed in Team of Rivals. But he wasn't an impressive figure. He wasn't what women swooned over by any stretch of the imagination by his appearance. We often hear, when he spoke, there was a Kentucky twang. He didn't sound like the great orator that we read him to be. If you actually had the experience of listening to Lincoln, you would have maybe not have been impressed by the sound of what you heard. You would have had to strain to listen to the content of what you heard to be able to pick it up. And so I'm always fascinated by that, and how would that have played in that diverse population center that you're talking about called California, even though electorally all those groups are not having any say. How would that have played? Would the strange sounding guy from Illinois be accepted, or would he be something else? Chris, you look like you're chomping at the bit to say something.
I do, because I am right now really thinking about the last Texas governor the last Texas president we ever had, Senator Cornpone, LBJ, or also the first Californian that we ever had as President, Nixon. And both of them really had this feeling of being outsiders to kind of an Eastern establishment. So part of me is sitting here thinking, you know what? Maybe the frontier, a little rougher around the edges Lincoln feels more at home, is more of a duck in water as the governor of California than as president, dealing with Stewart, dealing with all of these other more Eastern establishment figures.
I guess the bigger question I want to ask, what's been running through my head even going down this, is I can imagine a scenario where Lincoln is very successful in business or in politics or both in California. We talked about this. Chris and I were talking a little bit before off podcast, before we started recording, the Civil War as we know it, California is a state, has been admitted by then in 1850, but there's very little of the actual fighting that happens west of the Mississippi to any great extent. There is, but not to any great extent. The bulk of the war is contained is east of the Mississippi. Bulk of the war is contained even further east than that when you really get down to it. Does Lincoln rise to be a national figure before the Civil War? Lincoln's election is the catalyst for the outbreak of the war. That probably still sets up as it does no matter what, just because that was the division that led to the Republicans being able to slip in. If it wasn't Lincoln, it would have been somebody else probably that would have elicited the same result. But, is there the scenario where we still may end up with a President Lincoln? I guess that's one of the questions I want to hear from both of y'all on. But also maybe is that a later version of Lincoln? Is Lincoln some type of post-Civil War president because he's isolated during much of the war? He's out west. And so, then he comes in after the war, a different role at a different time. And so there may still be a President Lincoln, but not the wartime Civil War president that we think of, something entirely different, this Californian Lincoln who comes in some other role. Either of you have any thoughts just about the 10,000 things I threw out there and then I'm now going to shut up and listen to?
Do you have something, Eric? Because I've got one interesting thought.
I defer to you, sir.
This is something we touched on a little bit, and I guess we're going to pull this string now in the latest episode of The Room Where It Happened. Maybe Lincoln not having to deal with Reconstruction was a really good thing. And so a later Lincoln coming into, let's say he does somehow come into the presidency in 68-ish. Everything he was saying towards the end of the Civil War was very conciliatory. He was from Kentucky, which was a border state. The actual president after the Civil War for a lot of Reconstruction was also from he was originally from North Carolina, but he had been governor of Tennessee. He was a senator from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson. And so he also was kind of more conciliatory towards the old Confederate Democrats. So I'm sitting here and thinking about a situation where Lincoln may wind up getting impeached almost because of those fights between a president who wants to be conciliatory and the radical Republicans who want military occupation, and to really drive home the fact that you just lost.
I struggle with this because I definitely see where you're coming from, Chris, about towards the end, Lincoln was kind of going with forgive the I do religious scholar work as a hobby. So this whole universal like mercy situation, almost a universal like salvation of like, let's all assume that we had the best of intentions and we try to move on. 10% of the voters have to just swear loyalty to the United States and they're back through. I think it really depends on what those states then do in terms of, say, civil rights. Like someone who I think we often forget about, who was a great proponent of civil rights, was Ulysses S. Grant, to the fact that he was willing to take military action to enforce, the safety of African-American citizens after the Civil War. Something we kind of forget because the rest of his administration was fairly a mess, but, we move past it. I get my main concern is that if Lincoln, if for some reason is a president later on, who becomes president, I have a suggestion for that. Henry Clay. That's right. We brought back the Clay continuum in a new glorious form.
Yeah. Clay is always an interesting character for me. You mentioned the Clay continuum there. We've talked to, I know it's a favorite topic of Brent, who's on the show, has been on the show a number of times. Clay is the great compromiser. Clay is the great almost president, so many times that, it's one of those things. It's as one of my good friends calls him, if you know this reference, he's the Susan Lucci of being president, in terms of never winning the daytime Emmy for her role.
I have to say William Jennings Bryan, though. I have to throw him into that mix.
William Jennings Bryan is just Clay brought back later in time. And, in my mind, they're the same. In fact, I don't think I ever saw pictures of them in the same room. So I'm assuming they're the same guy, just split out over time. And American history is replete with those type of very influential actors who never actually, hold the office, but are incredibly influential in what they do. Clay dominates multiple decades there. I mean, Clay is the reason that the war doesn't happen. In my opinion, the Civil War doesn't happen long before when it did. It's because of Clay doing so much to avoid the scenario through compromise. We'll figure out some way to kick this can. We've been kicking down the road. We'll keep kicking it, because if we ever stop kicking it, we've got a major problem. And that obviously turned out to be the case. When it actually happened, it was bad. That's I think another place we can go, probably on a future episode, Eric, if you'll join us, we can talk about some Clay presidency scenarios, because I think there are some fun what ifs to really consider here, moving forward over time.
I would love that. I have a question for you gentlemen at this time. So Lincoln has, during the course of his presidency, kind of a spotty record on Native Americans, like the Dakota War happens under his watch. There's also the expulsion of Navajo peoples. In a state like California, which has a large population of Native Americans, many of whom, like Miwoks, were kind of that weird balance between enslaved and indentured out by their tribes to men like John Sutter. How do you think that would influence Lincoln and his views on Native Americans? And in the form that it takes in California, does that also change his ideas about slavery?
I'll let you go first, Chris.
First, I agree with you that he definitely had, I guess it would be the best way to put it would be, he was a man of his times when it came to relations with Native Americans, as opposed to being a man ahead of his time. I guess is one way to put it.
maybe
people
status
involved-
quo would have been the better term to use than spotty record. Like he's following a policy that has been set by prior administrations.
People, I just to throw back to earlier in this episode, how did he meet his Donner Party connection?
Black Hawk
Hawk.
War.
There was definitely the rising in Minnesota. I want to say in '64. I want to say Red Cloud. I could be wrong on that. In the middle of the
Little Crow,
yes,
I believe.
Yes, during the Civil War. The Homestead Act is definitely designed to do almost what Hastings did, which is get Anglo faces out there. And when you get Anglo faces out there, they're displacing certain people, and Native Americans are who they're displacing. So I think it's interesting to think about. Most of the time when you hear about the issue of race and slavery, it's thought of in the binary Eastern United States format. And I think you're raising a really interesting issue here, talking about California, where race is not binary. You do have a lot of other groups coming in. And it's also somewhat separated from the economic condition it is in the Eastern United States. Do people have thoughts on that?
I immediately go there and thinking about, you're talking about the rights of those who do not possess the same rights as others, which is what this is about, whether it's slavery in the classic Southern plantation sense. So we're thinking there about blacks being enslaved, African Americans being enslaved, or whether you're thinking about, Native Americans being continually restricted and dispossessed of their lands and moved to other places in smaller and smaller boxes that those are put into over time. And even thinking about during the period leading up to the Civil War, suddenly what popped into my head, again from my Texas history experience, thinking about the Sam Houston experience, thinking about the Andrew Jackson experience. Those two are connected, but they have very different experiences when it comes to Native Americans. I mean, Houston lives among the Native Americans. Jackson is very much a part of the military apparatus that's, relocating, forcibly moving Native Americans. I do think that you probably have Lincoln influenced in a different way out west just because of what he's around. And so maybe he's now exposed to more of a multi-ethnic concept, more of what went on with the Spanish settlers, so Mexicans that were there, the Chinese influence, all the things that go with that. I think of Lincoln in so many ways as the ultimate pragmatist. And the famous statement that goes with that is, I'm about preserving the Union. All free, all slave, half free. I don't care. My job is to preserve the Union. And when
if I could preserve the Union by setting free the slaves, I would. If I could preserve the Union by setting some free, I would, and some enslaved. If I could preserve the Union by setting no one free, I would.
Yeah, and to me, that's the ultimate expression of what we see in so many of the ways that he expressed himself before his presidency and during his presidency is being pragmatic. He's about finding solutions. And so I still think that same guy shows up in California, and maybe those solutions look different because of what you're exposed to and around there. The other thing that strikes me is, I mentioned Manifest Destiny because, this is all happening in like the peak of Manifest Destiny. That's why there's a Mexican-American war. That's why there's the move out, finding gold there helps, giving more, but it was already happening. Is in whatever scenario we have him successfully crossing from Illinois to California, he crosses that country, which means that he has the firsthand experience with what that crossing means. And he also has the firsthand experience about just how vast this country is, so the California version of Lincoln, I think, is probably, regardless of whether it's the Donner Reed party-like experience that gets him there or something that's much, much less, dramatic than the historical Donner Reed party, the Lincoln that shows up in California is impacted by the fact that he spent 6 to 8 months getting across the nation, getting there and knowing what that's about. And I was trying to think through my head, when is there really the first Western president in our real timeline? And it doesn't immediately spring into my mind when that is. And the reason for that is you don't see the leadership in the West being able to come and influence what are the electoral presidential politics because of the concentration of the electoral college and how that works. And so, we talk about, Lincoln as president in the the latter half of the 19th century, whenever that might have been. Probably not, because when was there somebody from the West who was able to ascend to that, barring something unforeseen or something radically different?
You and I talked about this when we were talking about the Western theater. How do you define the West? Because if my figuring is correct, we might be talking about Hoover or Eisenhower of Kansas. And if you're talking actual Pacific border, it's Nixon.
Right. And so, and in California in particular, in that particular example there. And so, to me, the interesting thought is if you displace Lincoln to California, I think you have obviously his influence on what California is and becomes, and California influences him. But do we know the California Lincoln as a national figure the way that we know Illinois Lincoln? And my first blush is no, because there would have been no, unless he chooses to come back. And that's a whole other thing that could have happened. It's not saying that he wouldn't have come back. And if he does come back, then I think that's an interesting thing to explore. And I'd like us to explore a little bit. Does he come back different? So maybe he does come back to Illinois, in a very short period of time, so much so that maybe he is in the hunt for, the 1960 election through other means that are there. If you have, I keep calling him California Lincoln. If you have California Lincoln back in Illinois, how is the new Illinois Lincoln different having been California Lincoln?
Well, if you want me to get fully into that, have me back for another episode. But also, we can call California Lincoln Californian Abraham Lincoln.
There you go.
The first thought I have is, how does a California Lincoln differ from a John C. Fremont, who's also involved in Republican politics and also has a little bit of a more Western twang, power base, whatever you want to call it? The other interesting thing, and I'm going to call back to a discussion we were having earlier. You mentioned Lincoln's comments on his overarching pragmatic objective was to maintain the Union as president, and he would do whatever it took to make that happen. As governor of California, what is his overarching pragmatic goal? The reason I stress that is this. We mentioned all of these other groups that are present in California. None of them have the franchise. The people that have the franchise are Anglo settlers. So do you get a situation where you've got a more populist Lincoln who's advancing the cause against, who's starting the process of reservationizing a lot of these native tribes that have just become Americans? What is, as a governor of California, what is his preserving the Union? What's his equivalent of that through which anything serves?
I don't know. And that's what makes it hard, is because I think what we struggle with Lincoln is we know the Lincoln of the real history so intimately, because and how he influenced events and events influenced him. And then this sort of relates back to, okay, this is the second, we're only allowed to do 3. I'll drop a room where it happened reference again. But we were talking about the Kennedy assassination. What eventually Kennedy becomes, we don't know, because it's cut short. What Lincoln becomes, either as president in Lincoln facing Reconstruction, or a different Lincoln who lives beyond the Civil War, we don't know, because we don't have that to compare from history.
The other thing that is interesting about Lincoln, he is known, but he's not known. You have very intelligent people that will sit here and argue against the quote you just used, Eric, that he would free every slave if it would preserve the Union. They basically say that is fluff. That's what he's saying to actually stay in power. Because if he comes out and says what he actually wants, he will either never take office or will not get any support there. So there is that debate today amongst Lincoln supporters. Does he evolve or does he start out the person we think about? And also, it's really, we did talk about it a little bit. Even though he's remembered as the great progressive, the great emancipator, what he's saying about Reconstruction is a little bit, we're all going to sit around a campfire, sing Kumbaya, and move forward together. I'm a little more of a fan of the Grant proposal, where you occupy him and you make it happen.
Yeah, well, I've often heard argued by historians and commentators, would there have likely been essentially a second Civil War? If it's Lincoln that is dealing with the aftermath of the first Civil War. We've spent so much time on all of our podcasts talking about World War I and World War II and how they connect together. The peace of the U.S. Civil War creates problems. Different versions of that would have created entirely different problems, I think. And Lincoln had also been, worn down to a great degree by, the events of being the president during that event. I mean, it's hard for me to even imagine that. I don't think I really can imagine that. I try to imagine what it's like. But, one of the things I've often heard historians comment about, the photographs, and we actually, Lincoln is a the unique place of being photographed because photography had started to become, more of what was enabled there to make that happen. Is there's this pervasive sadness, just about the man. Now, part of that's his personal life, death of children and, a wife that, is a challenge to be married to, apparently. I'll just leave it at that. But, he's this profoundly sad person, so much so that he wants to not have conflict because conflict has just worn him down. And maybe what was needed, as you point out, Chris, in the Reconstruction was somebody willing to, now we have to finish this. The conflict looks a little bit different, but there's still going to be conflict in making this happen. And I think that's a challenging thing for us to get our heads around is Lincoln may have been spared by being shot. That's an odd thing to say, but he may have been spared in some ways by being shot.
I was thinking this kind of along similar lines. It's kind of the same thing as I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone, but JFK kind of had the same thing. If JFK had survived, it's not really a sure thing that he could have passed the legislation that Lyndon B. Johnson got passed.
Yeah,
he was just a more savvy politician.
Yeah, it's the Kennedy legacy. We talked about that exclusively on the show that we talked about. That is, Johnson preserves the Kennedy legacy. You can argue that, I don't know anything that Johnson actually preserved. He was Johnson, right? But, as you pointed out, Grant and others later enabled the victory of the war to be for something that was in the long term, I think, and we're still fighting that war. Candidly, as somebody who lives in, the South/Southwest, but just enough into the South, that war's still not over. And I don't think it ever will be over in a classic sense to some degree, but there's still more to be done there. But I think it had the chance to flare up again in a way that would have turned into conflict again potentially that could have happened very quickly under Lincoln and Lincoln administration.
Think it through. Versailles didn't settle Germany's hash. Yalta did. It is from a historical perspective, is it better to rip the Band-Aid off?
There's an argument to be made.
Yeah. I would say that part of the failings of the Versailles Treaty was that it came without Germany being occupied, which the South was. Germany could, unfortunately, a lot of Germans could then say, like, well, we were betrayed. I never saw any soldiers come up in here. What are you talking about? We lost. And as a Jewish person, I very much feel passionate about this subject. And it's something a lot of people say, Eric, why do you talk about Nazis so much? And it's like, it's a whole thing. Let's just get past it. But as to your point, Chris, that we don't really know the heart of Abraham Lincoln as much as we can know anybody's, like, good intentions or their soul, for lack of a better term. I think what would be the most likely course of action, and I'm just going to aim for the back. I'm just going to shoot it out there. What I think is Lincoln probably becomes a representative, if not the governor of California, eventually becomes the governor. And I could see him altering his views of slavery as saying, hey, I have always advocated more for the free soil policy of Henry Clay, to where it's not that I want to end slavery. I just think that economically it is a detriment to white farmers and white businessmen who are trying to get ahead, and they can't do that if there is this free labor source. So I could see him even going in for the emancipation of Native Americans, whether that means just emancipation but reservations for them. I couldn't say 100%. I also think that we could see Lincoln being for the enfranchisement of those Spanish and Mexican settlers into California who have remained, and probably use that as a power base of his own, saying, hey, we're all talking about male universal suffrage. These are men, and these are not as, please forgive this phrase, they are not as dark-skinned. As anyone who can tell you, after the Spanish Reconquista, we get the phrase blue-blooded because the Catherine of Aragon and her husband, his name escapes me, would point to the veins in their arms and say, I'm blue-blooded. I'm fair, which was
I'm lightly complected enough that you can see my arterial and venous construction underneath, and that's not true of others.
Yeah. So that's where I think he kind of builds up this base for himself. And I do think he could pursue the presidency as a true Westerner. Western-ish. Technically, Hawaii would be the most Western state of us all.
Yeah, we're not even to the annexation there yet. That's a whole. By the way, that's a whole other topic that I have queued up as a future topic for Fork in Time. So stay tuned at some point in the future for that. Guys, we're drawing down to the close of the time that we allotted, so I don't think we finished this topic. We're going to come back, and I have to come back and revisit it, maybe from another jumping off point here at some point. I'd be intrigued to do that. I like the idea of other Lincolns. Thinking about other Lincolns, I think, is an interesting concept in general, just because it's around a thing that is often, Chris and I have talked about this frequently off podcast. We've mentioned a few times on podcast. The Civil War tends to be one of the things that you see most alternate history flow around for all kinds of reasons. It seems to be a lightning rod for a lot of alternate history thought. There's lots of interesting things that you can do around it that have nothing to do with changing the outcome of the war, but moving some of these players around to different theaters around that, I think, that are also interesting to look at without getting caught in the what if the South had won or what if something else, but just moving some of the players around. Even the idea of like a Henry Clay presidency, what could that have looked like? Could a settlement have been brokered that would have avoided the whole thing? Because to me, one of the most interesting things about the Civil War, and I know I've gone far afield here, is given enough time and technology, there's another path that could have led us out of the need for slave labor in the South. That doesn't solve the problem. It probably creates other problems, but there's other ways with just a little bit more time passing that things might have also played out differently and sort of in interesting ways. that
And-
we haven't even gone down that path in any episodes ever, but we're going to at some point.
I want to say we've touched on this thought, which is if you don't have it reminds me a little bit of what you were saying about the California trip. There's a very sweet spot where it can't be too late or it can't be too early. It can't be too late because at that point you've got economic and material industrial changes changing the economic underpinning of the slave system. It can't be too early because those changes have already started in the North, and that's why they're able to win the way they are.
Exactly
so maybe
right.
if Clay isn't able to patch together some of the compromises he is, and it does come to blows earlier, the North doesn't have some of its advantages.
Yeah,
Or even if Stephen Douglas somehow became president and got to enact the railroad policy, it may not have been such this is a relative term, easier victory for the North if the South has just as much transportation technology.
I also the thing that struck me about the idea of California Lincoln coming back is this idea of railroads play a huge part in the Civil War, as is being referenced there. The Transcontinental Railroad is an important aspect of what's going to happen as a result and shortly after there. But this idea, if you spent 8 months crossing the continent, the idea of getting a railroad that will get you all the way across that as soon as possible is something that's a lot more intriguing to you. And of course, it's being driven by California becoming a state and the need to have that transportation, some other way. By the way, there's a whole canal thing we can go down there too if we want to at some point, that flows off of that as well.
A lot like Eisenhower's assignment during the First World War of how would we be able to cross the country using our new great mechanized army, realizing we can't, and that setting up the interstate highway system.
The subtle things tend to play a little bit more there. Eric, any closing thoughts here before we close out the show, close out the episode? Anything big we missed?
I really just want to reiterate Chris's thoughts in that we can't ever truly know, which is a very frustrating thing for all of us. I think it's part of what makes us human is that we can't know, is that we can never truly say 100% what the heart of a person holds. And so, which is a great thing about this topic, is that we can imagine a whole plethora of possible scenarios and how Lincoln comes to be. And at the same time, we can't really imagine it. I didn't mean to get nihilistic there about the whole mission of the podcast, but just something to reflect upon. Also, I think Cannibal Lincoln, I've been trying to make a pun out of that. Can-ABE-Lincoln. That's the best that I could. But I have come up with a slogan.
I do feel like this is an amazing Halloween movie that needs to be made at some point. Cannibal Lincoln versus Vampire Slayer Lincoln. That has definitely,
Yeah.
Instead of the rail splitter, he's the man eater.
Yeah.
About allegedly. Yeah. And I agree. I think there's one of the things you hit upon a nice thing there, Eric, as we close out here. That's what I enjoy about why we started this podcast, is that even as much as you think what that branch would look like, there's always the fact that you can't be 100% sure, and there's the small subtle things which can be huge. I mean, for whatever reason, this is something as simple as, what if Mary Todd wasn't pregnant? That alone may change the outcome there. And again, if you end up with Lincoln being on the historical Donner Party and not being a survivor, then you've totally changed this small thing about the conception of, unfortunately, a child that's going to die soon anyway. So didn't directly have an influence in history per se, influence history in a major way, potentially by a decision that was made. My guess is Lincoln seems to me to be the adventurous type in a lot of ways. That's one of the things I think you can say about him overall. He seems to be the type of guy who would have gone, everything else being equal, but everything else is not equal. And that's, part of the interesting thing of what's there. So I'll close us out on that. Eric, thank you for joining us. We will have you back. So be thinking about topics you'd like to consider there. And as we said all along, and I'm going to close out on this, it's been a theme of the last couple of shows, both here on A Fork in Time as well as on The Room Where It Happened. And this is what this is about for us now. It's about growing a community of people who like to talk about this and hearing their points of view and hearing their thoughts on things. So first of all, thank you for reaching out and actively engaging with that. I would encourage others to do the same. By the way, you do that at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. I think Eric would tell you it's pretty easy to fill out a form there. And when Don's on his game, you'll actually get a response within a couple of days pretty quickly when he's doing things right. So what, less than 2 weeks from when you first reached out, Eric, give or take, to being here now? Not even that,
but
right?
It's okay, Don. I was in Hawaii, so
okay, fair enough.
If I was spending my entire time just by my laptop of like, will Don write me back? I think I would be missing the point of the trip, and my fiance would be very upset.
I would agree with that. I would totally agree with that. So again, Eric, thanks for joining us. Chris, any closing thoughts before we shut her down here today?
No, I think this was another of those episodes where we got it like maybe a third of the way through, and then we just kind of winged it. I think it was a good winging.
Yeah, and I think we left plenty of paths to go down. We left maybe a Hastings cutoff or two of our own that we can go and explore that we'll come back to at some point. So once again, Don, on behalf of Eric and Chris, saying thank you to our listeners. Join us next time, and looking forward to it then. And Chris, if somebody were to happen upon A Fork in Time, any thoughts on what maybe they ought to do?
Follow the letters left for them, hopefully, or
I like that. Look for Hastings posts in the literal sense, posts on posts, and figure out where to go, and maybe choose to take it. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.